Hey guys, welcome to the second in lectures on the respiratory system. Last time we left off, we were at gotten down into the trachea, just beneath the pharynx, and of course, you don't want to have your trachea blocked. I'm sure we've all had the experience of having something caught in our throat, um, and it can be a very mortifying experience. And of course, the sad thing about having a blockage in your throat is you can be perfectly healthy and just die because you can't get any air. So one of the typical procedures in emergency medication or medicine for that kind of an issue would be a tracheostomy. And a tracheostomy is when you puncture a hole in the throat. Now remember, the trachea is surrounded by these thick rings of cartilage, so you have to get between the rings. Um, in this diagram, you show that the location for the trach tube is going to be just beneath the cricoid cartilage, right at the bottom of the voice box. And of course, you would take some sort of a tube that won't collapse. It won't be, closed by the pressure of the intaking air or by the tissues around it, and insert it in there, and voila, you're going to live. Of course, one of the other common ways to maintain an airway is a procedure called an intubation or endotracheal intubation. And of course, if you've ever had general anesthesia, you've been intubated, and so a respiratory therapist will insert this tool called a laryngoscope. It compresses your tongue. The tip of it will actually open up the epiglottis, and then they can snake a tube all the way down into your trachea, deep down, and just almost where the bronchi divide. And so if you've had general anesthesia, you've had a trach tube to maintain your airway and to help make sure that you're respiring. But of course, right now in the COVID epidemic, um, having the ability to intubate and hook people up to ventilators has been a critical issue. So people are so sick that they require a mechanical ventilator, and this is the first step in providing that. So the trach is a tube, again, surrounded by these cartilaginous rings. They're incomplete. They're C-shaped rings. They're complete in the front, and they have an opening in the back where they connect to the back of the esophagus. There's smooth muscle and connective tissue back there. In this illustration, you can see that the bottom of the pharynx is delineated by that flap called the epiglottis, and it covers the trachea and the larynx. And that trachea descents about 15 inches long, and it splits. It undergoes bifurcation. Of course, bifurcation is this pattern of division after division, and so we can see that the tracheal tree breaks up into the two bronchial trees, and the difference between the right and left has to do with the numbers, really. So on the right bronchial tree, you'll see three bronchioles, and we call them secondary and tertiary based on how big their diameter is. So every time you bifurcate, you diminish your dimensions, and on the right I have three major bronchial branches. On the left, two, and this relates to types of pneumonia. Sometimes you can have double pneumonia, and sometimes you can have triple pneumonia, and they refer to the number of lobules that are involved. In fact, the left lobe of the lung only has two lobes, and the right has three. So this bronchial tree, this bifurcation, this division after division is a pattern we see in nature all the time. If you flip the bronchial tree upside down, it looks just like a tree out in your backyard. And of course, the purpose of this has to do with the maximization of surface area. All right, so if you recollect from way back in biology class, you learned about cell transport, and we're talking about gaseous transport here. If you recollect, this is simple diffusion through the cell membrane, and so the more surface area I have, the more exchange I can do, And that's the goal of the lungs, is to maximize exchange. Okay, so we have these massive increases in surface area because of the divisions and bifurcations. In fact, I think the old saw was that if you could expand the lungs out, they'd cover the surface area that would be the same size as a tennis court. It's pretty big. Well, these trachea bifurcates into two bronchi, which bifurcate into the bronchioles, and they bifurcate and bifurcate ultimately until we get down into the end of these little blind sacs. That's what an alveolus is. It's a blind sac, and the alveoli are really where the action occurs. So you can see the alveoli here. They're a single cell thick. They're made up of simple squamous epithelium. They are associated with capillary networks that surround the alveoli. And of course, capillaries are also one cell thick, made up of simple squamous epithelium. So there's where everything happens, and we'll look at the exchange mechanisms in the alveolus in some detail in a minute. The lungs are big. If you tap just above your breastbone to your throat, you'd be pretty close to the top of your lungs. And when you inspire, when you take a nice deep breath, those lungs get dragged down deep into the thoracic cavity. Of course, at the base of the lung is this big muscle called the diaphragm. Remember that the cavity that the lungs are held in is the thoracic cavity, but more succinctly, the pleural cavity. Remember, the pleural cavity surrounds the lungs. And when we talk about things, anything that has to do with pulmonary or pleural, we're talking about lung function. Remember that the lungs are contained inside the pleural epicardium and the pleural sac, and that allows the generation of some a vacuum, frankly. It allows you to breathe. So the base of the thoracic cavity or the pleural cavity is made up of the diaphragm, but you also have some important muscles that make up the rest of the thoracic wall, and they include things like the pectoralis major and minor. You have scalene muscles, these little serratus muscles that sort of weave into the rib cage, and they allow you to expand and then contract your lungs. Okay, so your intercostals help drag that cage down, and the serratus help expand it up. Well, that's it for some of the major anatomy. Let's talk a little bit about physiology now. We'll start off with carbon dioxide transport. You may say, hey, why are we talking about oxygen? Isn't that why your lungs are there, to move oxygen around? And of course that's true, but the other major component is to get rid of CO2. And, frankly, getting rid of CO2 is more important than taking in oxygen at a certain level. If you'll recollect, we've talked about the bicarbonate ion buffer system in the past when we talked about acids and bases. So here it is again. Remember that carbon dioxide and water combine to form this carbonic acid, or bicarbonate ion. And the carbonic acid dissociates into the bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions. Remember that acids donate hydrogen ions, and there's a perfect example of that. In fact, this movement from hydrogen ions to the bicarbonate ion, back to carbonic acid, and then back to carbon dioxide and oxygen is a critical buffering system in the blood. So carbon dioxide actually diffuses in red blood cells. There's carbon dioxide that's carried just simply in the blood, and but then it moves into the red blood cells and promotes something called a chloride ion shift. So the bicarbonate ions negatively charged, chloride ions are negatively charged, and as bicarbonate ion migrates into and out of red blood cells, it causes a similar flux of chloride ions in and out. And so once again, we see these electrolytes, these ions like chlorine, have a critical role in helping maintain homeostasis. Don't worry about the chloride shift. Just know that it's occurring in response to the binding of bicarbonate ions. So CO2 is moved a couple different ways. The gaseous CO2 can just be dissolved in plasma. It can be combined with hemoglobin to form this amino hemoglobin, and then, of course, it's also stored as the bicarbonate ion. When CO2 is brought to the lungs, that CO2 is released. Okay, and as as the oxyhemoglobin is turned from deoxyhemoglobin, we release the bicarbonate ion to form carbonic acid. And once that carbonic acid is formed, CO2 is evolved and it's released from the lungs. Which brings us to exchanges of gases generally. There's a concept called partial pressures, and I think my thing is